Hello. Welcome back to Rockford Reading Daily. I don't think I've ever started one of these episodes by saying hello. That's not a it's not a greeting I use normally in life. So, we are continuing to read Sister Citizen by Melissa V. Harris Perry. We are on page 12. In their eyes were watching God. Tea Cake and Janie finally find their way back home after the storm has subsided. Even then, they are not safe. Tea Cake was bitten by a rabid dog while saving Janie, and he ultimately succumbs to madness and delusions. Janie must shoot him to save her own life. Stories from New Orleans in the first days of the flood echoed this plot element as well. Despite the baffling silence of the federal government and the unanswered cries for help, initial media coverage focused on criminal activity rather than on massive human suffering. Left without adequate medical supplies, food, or water, New Orleans tried to fend for themselves by taking necessary items from stores and businesses. These attempts at survival in a disaster were labeled criminal and were denounced by the very government agencies that failed to provide the urgently needed relief. The governor of Louisiana, Kathleen Blanco, initially voiced her outrage at looters while remaining silent on the lack of coordinated federal response. On August 31st, CNN reported that Governor Blanco was, quote, just furious, end quote, about lawlessness. Quote, we'll do what it takes to bring law and order to our region, end quote, she pledged. On the same day, the Associated Press reported New Orleans Mayor Ray Nagin had ordered most of the city's dramatically limited police force to halt rescue efforts and to concentrate on stopping looters who had, quote, grown more aggressive, end quote. Television news reported roving, armed gangs of young black males opportunistically profiting from the tragedy. Reports suggested these men were stealing from electronics stores, raping women trapped in the evacuation centers, and trying to assassinate relief workers. Later evidence showed that most of these young black men were organizing to assist other survivors who were unable to find supplies: the elderly, the sick, and women with children. These men were portrayed as rabid criminals, but their, quote, madness, end quote, resulted from trying to save and care for their companions and fellow survivors. In this, they were like Hurston's tea cake. That desperate survivors were portrayed as dangerous criminals was largely a result of the racialized nature of the Katrina disaster. Americans have long connected urban African American communities with crime. Decades of research in sociology, political science, and psychology demonstrate the facile link between blackness and criminality that exists for many Americans. In early reports, many U.S. media sources followed a traditional formula of representing black people as dangerous and criminal. Black residents were accused of looting, drug abuse, homicide, and rape during the disaster-evoked chaos. Most of these media-reported crimes were never substantiated, and later research showed that extensive pro-social behavior, not crime, was the primary response of survivors in the days following Katrina. Still, the alchemy of race and disaster produced a powerful image of chaos and crime that dominated the first news reports. In this way, Hurricane Katrina became more than an object lesson for preparing for natural disaster, overcoming massive destruction, coping with bureaucratic incompetence, questioning government responsiveness, appreciating civil society's flexibility, celebrating human resilience, or any of the other storylines that emerged in the months and years following the storm. One second, I gotta get something to drink. Here, and I will do a reflection here shortly. I want to see if we can get through this chapter or get through this introduction before we do it. Yeah, we're going to have a reflection for the introduction, though. Okay. Excuse me. Through its distinctive racial and political character, the debacle became a site for the contestation of black citizenship. Excuse me. Parnell Herbert, a New Orleans and Katrina survivor whose story is recorded in Overcoming Katrina, African American Voices from the Crescent City and Beyond, explains that even the visual images of Katrina told the story of black Americans laying claim to their rights as citizens. Quote, something that really surprised me was the number of African Americans in New Orleans who had large American flags in their homes. Were they flags that once draped a loved one's casket? Why did the survivors begging for help from the U.S. military forces feel it necessary to wave the American flag as opposed to a white sheet or blood-stained towels? End quote. Herbert's observation reminds us that when they waved their nation's flag, black New Orleans were making a specific claim of citizenship and belonging. In many ways, Hurricane Katrina can be read as Hurston's novel playing out in a contemporary moment. Race and class hierarchies structuring the consequences of a natural disaster, powerful white institutions ignoring black suffering, and black men driven mad as they try to rescue others in the aftermath of the storm. In Hurston's novel, The Everglades Hurricane is a definitive event revealing the inequalities of society, but it is not the entirety of Janie's life. Similarly, the women who endure Katrina's aftermath are more than storm survivors. They are workers, mothers, daughters, aunts, pastors, doctors, friends, and congregants. Their stories begin long before August 29, 2005, and their experience in the storm are shaped by the social positions they occupied before the levees failed. A racial analysis of the Katrina disaster has become received wisdom, but the story of this historic moment is a story not only of race, but of gender. As the disaster unfolded, black women became the main characters through whose suffering and resilience the media told the story. Just as Janie Mae Crawford is the focus of Hurston's novel, black women were at the eye of the rhetorical storm of Hurricane Katrina. It is on the bodies, minds, and lives of black women that the story of Katrina was written. Photographs of black mothers carrying their infants as they waddled through filthy, chest-high waters became enduring images of the disaster. Television news and popular magazines used images of desperate, frightened African-American women to dramatize the tragedy facing residents as they battled the aftermath of the hurricane with little official assistance. Their suffering became the conduit through which new conversations on race, class, and vulnerability began. They were the bridge over the deadly waters that allowed the rest of America to cross into the agonizing realization of how unequal the country remained at the dawn of the 21st century. Within 5 days of the storm, national media reports began to shift away from black men represented as looters, rapists, and snipers, and to focus instead on black women and children trapped in the city's evacuation centers. These women became the sympathetic victims of the storm. Post-Katrina New Orleans, as read through the lens of Hurston's novel, is a place to begin taking seriously the idea that black women's experiences act as a democratic litmus test for the nation. Legal scholars Lainey Guinier and Gerald Torres offered the useful metaphor of the miner's canary for understanding how the political and economic realities of marginal populations indicate the democratic and economic health of a nation. Miners use canaries with sensitive respiratory systems to alert them to poisonous gases in the atmosphere of the mine. In a similar manner, vulnerable communities of black and brown Americans foreshadowed the underlying problems likely to poison the U.S. system. In August 2005, black women of New Orleans became the nation's miner's canary. Okay, and then let's reflect here. Let me get something to drink real quick. I do start a lot of my sentences with my thoughts with I'm trying to work on not doing that as much. I know that can be distracting and annoying, so forgive me. What stands out to me initially is the the way she writes, the way that Melissa writes. I love the way she writes. I love the descriptive nature of it. I love the way she is connecting these multiple ideas with each other, the way she's connecting the movie or the book, excuse me, with Katrina and connecting the experiences of Janie with the experiences of Black women as a collective and as a whole. It brings into conversation what I think is the importance of symbolism. I think I think individualism is something that is good in doses for a movement, but it's good in doses in the sense of working together towards some type of collectivism, and being in the best individual or being the best version of the individual of yourself as in an effort to help the collective be the best version of the collective that it can be. But I think that within struggles and within movements, what typically is individualism can become symbolism. I hope I'm saying this in the right way. Where in some situations and in some circumstances in life, where somebody becoming synonymous with something, like somebody becoming the face of something, the face of a band, or the front person of the band, or the face of a team, or the face of the leading role in a movie. I think that what can happen is, and it's a very thin line, is when you have an understanding of the importance of the collective, when you have an understanding of the importance of the movement and the struggle, when you have an understanding of where you fit in individually in the moment in history that you are existing in, you can turn individualistic traits into symbolic traits. And instead of it being about you as an individual, you can allow yourself to become a symbol for whatever it is that you are involved in. And so when you can articulate, whenever I try my best, and this is something that I feel like I have some experience in, and this is something I still try to get better at on a daily basis, but I try my best when somebody speaks highly of me or speaks highly of actions that they've seen me do or things that they feel me to be connected with, to emphasize that there is multiple people involved in any organizing that goes on, that it has to be multiple people to be involved in organizing, that these things, aren't about me specifically, that the stories of the people that we have here on Say Their Name Square, the 15 people who have been killed or died in the custody of law enforcement, that their names are the names that we know are important to be repeated, and that their stories are the stories that we want to be told. And so I think that you can become a conduit. And that's what she's using, telling Janie's story as, and telling Janie's experience as. And I think that that's something that we've seen in the past happen with Dr. King and with Malcolm X and with Rosa Parks and with different people who have individually received acclaim for parts or actions in the struggle. And I just named a few people, there's many more. But with an understanding of where they fit in collectively, they use that into those individual accolades to become symbolic of the movement and the struggle, and I believe that a symbol is greater than a man, or a symbol is greater than a person or a woman, or individual, that you can be more as a symbol than you can be as an individual. A symbol can last much longer than an individual can last. And so I just think that the way she's talking about this character and talking about this book is very symbolic, and I think it's important to have an understanding of how symbolism can work within a movement. And then also Katrina, reading about her, talking about Katrina, just for me, it's making me think about things I hadn't thought about in years, because this is probably the most descriptive thing I've ever read about Katrina in my life. And just in pure honesty, like I remember when Katrina happened and it taking place and watching a lot of things, but since it's happened, it's not something that I've went back and haven't watched like a documentary on or read any books or read anything on. So for me, just it's triggering memories and triggering watching news clips and things like that I had forgot about. And so I think that's one of the things about history is how easily we forget it because of how quickly new events are happening. Okay. Issues of race, gender, and class inequality that affect Black women's lives in America point to problems embedded in the fabric of the nation. Katrina rendered those inequalities highly visible. Inadequate evacuation capacity pointed to America's failure to invest in modern public transportation systems. The levee failure was indicative of America's crumbling infrastructure. The delayed government response was a sign of the limitations of federalism and a harbinger of compromised homeland security. The grinding urban poverty revealed by the storm was prophetic of impending economic crisis. The disproportionate burden of the disaster shouldered by African American women was a symbol of the brutal intersections of race, class, and gender that Black women confront daily. The 19th and 20th century educator Anna Julia Cooper wrote, quote, "Only the Black woman can say, when and where I enter, in the quiet, undisputed dignity of my womanhood, without violence and without suing or special patronage, then and there the whole race enters with me." End quote. It is African American women surviving at the nexus of racialized gender and class disprivilege who marked the progress of the nation. In the 1970s, the African American women of the Combahee River Collective recognized their continuing position, writing, quote, "If Black women were free, it would mean that everyone else would have to be free since our freedom would necessitate the destruction of all the systems of oppression." End quote. At the start of the 21st century, as the floodwaters rose in New Orleans, the lives of Black women once again stood for America's failures to achieve its dream of democratic equality. Hurston's Janey undertakes a voyage of self-understanding, romance, psychic exploration, and communal struggle that represents something larger than her personal story. So, too, do the images and experiences of Black women trapped by the flood in New Orleans represent the broader political reality of race, gender, class, and vulnerability in the American state. Under the headline, quote, "Pray for us," end quote, the September 12, 2005 cover of Newsweek featured a distressed Black woman carrying an infant and a toddler as she raced for an evacuation bus. The caption read, quote, "A Katrina refugee and her 2 children," end quote. The Economist the same week displayed a weeping Black woman in a New Orleans t-shirt under the headline, quote, "The Shaming of America," end quote. These 2 magazine covers capture important elements of how depictions of Black women were used to frame the disaster. Early reports repeatedly referred to storm survivors as, quote, "refugees," end quote, and asked, quote, "How can an American city look like Mogadishu or Port-au-Prince," end quote. Excuse me, I don't think I pronounced those correctly. Despite being discussed as though they were distant foreigners, these Black women retained the power to shame the nation through their suffering. As women and mothers, they could represent victimization in a way that male survivors could not. In a country where patriarchal norms still demand that women and children be saved first, the abandonment of poor Black mothers and their children argue that these chivalrous impulses rarely extend to African American women. They shame the nation because the American narrative is triumphant and collective. Americans take great pride in understanding themselves as prosperous, just, and fair nations steeped in relative equality and uncompromised liberty. The televised deaths from dehydration of elderly Black women in a major urban center did not fit this triumphant narrative. It is a dangerous enterprise to introduce this text with the journalistic account in a literary frame because it risks reducing the massive human suffering caused by Hurricane Katrina to little more than a metaphor or literary device. More than 1,500 people died in the aftermath of Katrina. More than 500,000 were permanently displaced. Billions of dollars of property was damaged. Entire communities were wiped away. Homes, schools, churches, and stores were irreparably damaged. Decades of family memories were lost. Centuries of tradition were altered in moments. Years after the storm, the city of New Orleans continues to struggle with the blight, economic devastation, and personal suffering induced by the levee breach. To try to understand the consequences of Katrina through a Harlem Renaissance novel is to risk a dangerous mediation of experience that makes already vulnerable persons into little more than characters in a story. Despite these dangers, there is something important to be gained from understanding this experience through the lens of fiction. Literary parallels can reveal truths that might otherwise be obscured. That is why I begin this work of social science with the work of fiction. Literature crafts a specific story to reveal a universal truth. I want to make a claim for Janie, as well as for the individual Black women whom Janie represents, as an appropriate subject for the study of broader phenomena. It is important to understand political processes through the vulnerable human lives that are part of the larger story. By Henry Louis Gates' reading, Their Eyes Were Watching God, does its most important political work by subverting our expectations of what counts as political. Like Hurston, I hope to disrupt our assumptions about the study of politics by beginning my investigation of contemporary American politics in the hearts and minds of ordinary Black women. This book is not a work of history, but it relies on Black women's history as a frame for understanding contemporary politics. It is not a work of literary criticism, but it relies on literature written by and about Black women. It is not a biography, but it gives us some Black women as an opportunity to tell parts of their personal stories. It is not a traditional social science text, but it makes use of empirical data. This book is concerned with understanding the emotional realities of Black women's lives in order to answer a political, not a personal question. What does it mean to be a Black woman and an American citizen? Black women are rarely recognized as archetypal citizens. Just as many of Hurston's critics were unwilling to acknowledge Janie's exploration of her psychic reality as politically important, so have political observers largely failed to consider what we can learn about American politics by exploring the psychology of Black women. This book is intended to correct that deficiency. I use the lived experiences of African American women as my point of departure for understanding democratic citizenship in the United States. I will provide empirical evidence that the internal worlds of Black women are both constituted by and influential in the political realities in which they live. Let me get something to drink. Man, that's just like a natural instinct for me to do that. All right, I'm working on that. We got like a page and a half left. I'll just do a reflection at the end of this. She in her bag. I don't want to cut her off. I ain't gonna even lie to you. So I got a lot of thoughts, but let's get to the end before I expound upon them. African American women face unique expectations as citizens of the United States. The particular histories of slavery, Jim Crow, urban segregation, racism, and patriarchy that are woven into the fabric of American politics have created a specific citizenship imperative for African American women, a role and image to which they are expected to conform. We can call this image the, quote, strong Black woman, end quote. It defines the mantle that the nation, Black communities, and Black women themselves expect African American women to assume. The social construction of Black women's citizenship and identity around the theme of self-sacrificial strength is a recurrent motif in Black women's lives and politics. The strong Black woman is easily recognizable. She confronts all trials and tribulations. She is a source of unlimited support for her family. She is a motivated, hard-working breadwinner. She is always prepared to do what needs to be done for her family and her people. She is sacrificial and smart. She suppresses her emotional needs while anticipating those of others. She has an irrepressible spirit that is unbroken by a legacy of oppression, poverty, and rejection. Over the course of this book, I will offer a theory of how the strong Black woman came to function as a racial and citizenship imperative for Black women. I believe that the construct of the strong Black woman does not arise from empirical observation of who Black women actually are. Instead, it is a racial and political construct emanating from the expectations of African American communities and from the needs of the nation that frame Black women in very narrow ways. In the language of political theorists, the strong Black woman myth is a misrecognition of African American women. But it creates specific expectations for their behavior within the American polity. Polity. I've never seen that word before. I'm assuming it's like the realm of politics. I first set out a theory of recognition as it relates to contemporary African American women. Then I explore the history of intentional misrecognition of Black women. Next, I discuss how these misrecognitions contribute to pervasive experiences of shame for Black women and try to understand how shame limits the opportunities for African American women as political and thought leaders. Finally, I claim that the imperative of impervious strength is, in part, a shame management strategy that has both emotional and political consequences for Black women. Like Hurston's novel, this book is not only a story of achieving personal fulfillment, but a call for the creation of new forms of politics rooted in a deep and textured understanding of Black women's lives. Empirical social science can illuminate the human experience of politics by forcing us to think about what it means to Black women when they seek to fulfill their responsibilities and access the rights of citizenship. This book uses statistical, experimental, and qualitative data to draw out these meanings. It also relies on Black feminist traditions that emphasize individual biographies and fictional narratives as entryways to understanding collective race and gender experiences. Hurston concludes her novel with Janie alone but self-possessed. She has survived personal attacks, rejection, and violence. She has also survived the impersonal, chaotic destruction of the hurricane. We are left with Janie pulling the world around her shoulders. Quote, she pulled in her horizon like a great fishnet, pulled it from around the waist of the world and draped it over her shoulder. So much of life in its meshes. She called in her soul to come and see. End quote. Instead of leading a community or movement, Janie chooses a solitary and contemplative life, but she is not entirely alone. The novel consists of Janie's retelling of her story to her sympathetic girlfriend, Phoebe, knowing that Phoebe will share the story with other women in town. Although Hurston does not tell us exactly what Phoebe does with Janie's story, we do learn that by listening to Janie, Phoebe comes to feel, quote, 10 feet taller, end quote. We know that she plans to return home to her husband and demand to be treated more equally. Phoebe's task is to hear Janie's story, be made taller by it, and use it to demand changes in the systems of racism and patriarchy that circumscribe American life. She challenges us because we, as readers, are in the same position relative to Janie. We have heard the story, and it is our job to make politics out of it. The book in your hands is not so much Janie's story as Phoebe's. Okay, that brings us to the end of the introduction and the beginning of the first chapter. Looks like it's a poem that comes in before the first chapter. Okay, that's interesting. I think that I enjoyed, this was unique out of all the, and really each book that we've read has been unique, but there has been sort of some of them that follow a certain type of formula. and this might follow it once we get deeper into the text. But I like that introduction. I did enjoy that. I think that very informative in sort of letting me know the lens that this book is going to be being told through. It harkens me back to Women, Race, and Class by Angela Y. Davis. It reminds me that I need to read more books where this is the perception and this is the outlook. And it reminds me of how many times I have, how some of these texts and books aren't from the perspective of Black women. And that's one of the things I need to be more proactive about, is making sure that we have more episodes within here that are from the perspective of other groups within the Black community, besides, or not even just the Black community, other groups, within communities. I think that we have had a pretty male-driven book reading, and it's been probably a healthy mix between Black males and white males. But so understanding that, I think that's one of the things that comes with collectivism, is understanding that I can never fully understand what it means to be a Black woman in America. I can never be able to walk in the shoes of a Black woman in America. But the best that I can do is to hear the story, is get the story, to get the experience, to hear that perspective and that vantage point, and to make sure that is a part of whatever belief system that I have and whatever ideology that I have, that I don't have a belief system or ideology that is ignorant to the experiences of Black women, that are ignorant to the experience, to the struggles of Black women. And that one of the books that we should, by the time you have heard this, got through reading, is the book Freedom is a Constant Struggle. And that was one of the first books that really took time to make me understand the importance of intersectionality. And the intersection of being Black and being a woman is something that is very unique in this country. And I think that the way that was put here, when it said that when Black women have equity and equality, that the world will be in a different place, or that I'm butchering the quote. I shouldn't even have tried to do that. The quote is within the passage, and my mind's just sort of going in different places now. So I'm gonna wrap this up instead of finding the quote. But the quote is in there within what we just read a few minutes ago. And so this is just, I love the introduction. I love the perspective that it was told from. It reminds me of the importance of that perspective and that vantage point being in any belief system that I have. It reminds me of the importance of Black women historically in all struggles that Black people have waged in this country, which means all struggles that have been waged in this country. And I'm excited to see what Melissa V. Harris Perry has awaiting us in Sister Citizen. So please share this on whatever platform you're listening to it on. We will be back tomorrow with another episode of Rockford Reading Daily. We will continue reading Sister Citizen, and we put these episodes out on a daily basis to provide you the opportunity to begin or further your journey in the struggle to end police terrorism, mass incarceration, and racial injustice. We outside.